Hello, I'm Dr. Louise Bodnar, the voice of the River Wye for Herefordshire Council's Nutrient Management Board and the Wye Catchment Partnership. The aim of the role is to enable the needs of the river to be taken into account and put forward without any other agenda or human interest. There are already groups on the Nutrient Management Board which act in the interest of the river, but these often have other interests, and some of them are campaigning or citizen science-based organisations. The voice of the river is a role designed to speak solely for the river and help counterbalance the anthropocentric structures of the local authority and the catchment partnership. Within the catchment partnership, all types of human interest in the river are represented: fishing, navigation, farming, house building, water sports. And the Nutrient Management Board, as you'd imagine, is focused on the high nutrient related problems on the Wye. But I think it's essential that nature and the river's needs are represented independently of any other human interests. So within the Nutrient Management Board, the river's voice has full voting rights, and I attend the quarterly meetings of both the Nutrient Management Board and the Catchment Partnership. In terms of how I've tried to work this approach, I've used my ecological expertise to bring the river's perspective to the board. For example, on the Wye, ecological modelling of the river has been used to look at changes to phosphorus and nitrogen levels in the Wye when different catchment-sensitive farming measures are carried out. But incredibly, the models show that even if every farm adopts all the entirely voluntary catchment-sensitive farming options, the Wye will still be in poor ecological health and fail its SSSI status. This is being described as a nutrient gap, but what it means is the Catchment Partnership and the Nutrient Management Board don't really have the tools to resolve the problems. Voluntary options aren't enough to prevent agricultural pollution of the river, so a series of other actions are needed. And as the voice of the river, I can bring these forward without the constraints of any other organisation. So part of the role is putting forward the scientific understanding of the needs of the river, but it is more than that. The river's voice also brings the perspectives held by the natural world, which are bigger than humans, older than humans. The river is ancient and can bring descriptions of previous ways of interacting with the river, previous ways of life and farming, can compare current and historic land uses with a perspective that harm coming to the river from farming is due to very recent changes. The river also reminds us that change is constant and not as impossible as it can feel within our tiny human timescales. The river has recovered from other types of pollution in its history. Industrial pollution is no longer an issue due to changes in laws, which took hundreds of years, but in the river's timescale, it's just momentary. So the river isn't bound by human legal systems and can speak about changes to current legislation. The voice can speak for the River Wye and all of its tributaries, all of the species associated with it, and all of the wetland habitats that form part of the river. So the role of the voice of the river is very much something beyond human emotion. I don't believe that the voice of the river's role is to shout and be angry. The Wye is very fortunate to have organisations such as Save the Wye and Friends of the Wye who work very hard with a lot of passion and lead campaigns. And as the voice of the river, I can support those, but that's not my primary role. Of course, everyone's approach to being a voice of nature will be different. But to me, it seems that the problems faced by the Wye are fundamentally problems about our relationship with the natural world, which we don't really understand nature and we perceive it as a resource for human use. Our relationship isn't one based on respect, because a resource doesn't require respect. It's not alive, it's not intelligent, it doesn't have its own agency or intention. So in my view, the role of the voice of the river is to change and challenge that worldview and to try and instill an understanding of an older, different way of relating to the world, to help us develop a modern but sacred relationship with nature. What do I mean by a sacred relationship? I mean a relationship that acknowledges our independence upon water and expresses gratitude to the river for the life-giving power of water, the rich soils created by the river's provision of our drinking water, protection of farms from droughts and floods and climate change, and all the joys from hobbies like water sports that bring to our lives, and all the mental health and physical health benefits associated with them, and for all of the lives of our non-human kin who are also dependent upon the river: salmon, crayfish, otters, birds, insects, goes on. The voice of the river role is also to inspire a vision of what's possible, a very positive restoration of the river in which new laws support sustainable farming, in which people have an increased nature-based relationships with more wildlife and better human health as a consequence. The role can also question the impact of actions and policies on the river and ensure that the river is considered. Asking questions to people about their impact on nature is another useful thing the river's role can bring. There's a strong education element to the role to generate an understanding of what a river is and does in a country where unmodified rivers are not familiar to people. How rivers work and what rivers do isn't widely understood. The causes of flooding are not widely understood, and how land use impacts on flooding downstream. Helping people to understand how rivers function is an important part of the role. To speak for the river, I believe, is possible when you consider what a river is and what their purpose is. A river has multiple intentions, and they are a crucial part of planetary systems that maintain homeostasis on Earth and enable Earth to continue to support life. Rivers have obvious roles within the water cycle, enabling life on land and playing crucial roles in maintaining Earth's temperature stability. Rivers also shape the landscape that we live on. They move, carve, and carry sediment. They determine the fertility of the landscape around them. Rivers are part of the carbon cycle and store carbon in the ocean. Rivers also cycle nutrients and rare minerals around the earth, making them available to animals and plants. Without them, many life processes just wouldn't be possible. Rivers want to be a river to fulfill all of those functions, and to understand that rivers are not just channels of water pinned between farmland, but rivers are wetland systems with multiple habitats on either side, connected to their floodplains, constantly moving, connected to the ocean, and a part of the rain cycle and how it rains, where rain goes, whether it floods or whether it returns to the river, draining through the land, enabling that to support crops. People need to understand how rivers work and the complexity of rivers in order to protect them. As you can see from some of the photos of the Wye throughout this presentation, even though the River Wye is one of the UK's least modified rivers, it has almost no riparian habitat along its banks. Generally, where there is tree cover along the river, it's one tree deep, and there's agricultural land use right up to the edge of the river channel. The Wye cannot fully function as a river because it's cut off from its floodplain along most of its length. The river isn't just a channel of water. Rivers are dynamic systems made up of land and water. And what we call the floodplain is actually part of the river. The river needs to and includes all of the wetland habitats adjacent to it. But this is what people in the UK think a river is supposed to look like. The river is considered beautiful in its current form and is not understood how much has been lost. The role of the voice of the river is to make people understand what a river really is and should be, what a river needs to be if our farming is going to be sustainable and our towns are to avoid flooding. Rivers in the UK have been modified for hundreds of years. We have no cultural memory of natural river systems and no understanding of what they do or what they look like. So in terms of practical examples of how I've tried to work this multiple approach, there's an element of a lawyer-like advocacy for a client, keeping the river in the forefront of discussions and people's minds when they're speaking about their own interests, combined with a priest-like role of speaking for another and trying to shift the context of our relationship with the natural world. I opened the first meeting with a speech designed to shift people's perspective on water in the hope of provoking thought about an element that we generally take for granted. Subsequent meetings, I open with a gratitude prayer to water, and at the end of that prayer, water also expresses thanks to the people present for their work for the river. At times, I have spoken as the river in the catchment partnership, where I was prompted to do this to answer a question posed by a researcher expressing surprise that the biota of the river appeared to enable the river to regulate the chemicals within the water. I spoke as the river to try to help people understand the intelligence of natural systems and the natural balance and interaction within them. I also speak to challenge the constraints of our current systems, our reliance on voluntary inadequate measures, the planning system which hasn't kept pace with the industrialisation of farming, NRW's development permit system which isn't fit for purpose and excludes all the off-site impacts of what it permits, including the spreading of manure, the Environment Agency's unwillingness to prosecute and to act only as an advisory body, and the farming rules for water, which allow arable farming directly adjacent to rivers and are not adequate to protect rivers from pollution. In terms of the outcomes I'm hoping for within this role, I would like to see a greater understanding of rivers, what they are and what they do. I would like to see a shift in our anthropocentric perspective, and I'd like to try and inspire gratitude for water's gifts and remind people of the importance of their work, inspiring them to do more, to challenge the apathy that tends to develop. I'd like to try to bring gratitude to help navigate some of the tension between the campaign groups and government agencies, and to increase the understanding of the intelligent responses of rivers as living organisms as part of a larger living entity of Gaia. So speaking for the river is a small step towards a wider cultural change, but perhaps it can be a catalyst for change, and voices of nature will become more and more common within our society. The role is simply to represent the river on board meetings, within board meetings for the Nutrient Management Board and the Catchment Partnership. But within the broad work of protected landscapes, there are many aspects which could benefit from including nature's voice. It's an opportunity to speak more broadly for the river. There are many possibilities that the river's voice can feed into. In terms of how people react to having a voice of the river on the board, mostly the responses are mostly positive. Generally, people are in favour here of anything that provides more support for the river. Environment Agency staff have thanked me for the perspective that I've brought, and the campaign groups are very pleased to see extra support for the river and the river having a voice. The campaign groups have said to me that they think the voice should be very different to just another campaigning voice. And they very much support the idea of a positive vision for the river that's focused on the river's needs and not the needs of all the stakeholders. The farming community has been slightly more sceptical, although I've met and walked the river with many different landowners now, visited Wildscapes projects. Some farmers are opposed to the river's call for more legislation, and some will oppose making space for water, though many farmers are already seeing the benefits of preventing flooding and giving them access to water during the more and more frequent droughts that we have over the summer. Some of the challenges within the role and in terms of making the role of the rivers effective The voice has no power other than a vote. The Nutrient Management Board itself doesn't have any power. Its benefit is bringing people together to create a round table where all of the impacts on the river and all of the stakeholders can be face to face and discuss the needs and the problems. But the board doesn't have any political or legal power to solve those problems. We're still reliant on existing legislative structures or voluntary actions. So the voice of the role of the river is within that structure, one with very limited power. There are also cultural barriers to the voice of the river having an impact in the organisations. There's a cultural inertia and resistance to change within the Environment Agency and NRW. The tendency for staff to adopt the cultural norms of the organisations rather than to fundamentally challenge anything. You know, Natural Resources Wales is founded on the mentality of nature as a resource to use. The Environment Agency, the only institution with legal power to enforce the law to protect rivers, but its accepted norm is just to give advice and not enforce the law. So there is tension and frustration within both the board that the river falls part of and within the role. It's a difficult role to do. People that take it on will care about the river, but it's a role in which you can't make things happen. You can only try to encourage things. You are only a voice. There are many local challenges on the Wye. I won't go into detail of all of these. Many of them are listed on the slide and are fairly self-explanatory. I'm sure most of you working with rivers will be familiar with these problems. And finally, in terms of my reflections on doing the role, it's not easy. The messages about the needs of nature need to be very clear and consistent. This does require an element of education about the natural world, and then sadly our average knowledge about nature is quite shockingly low. I'm constantly surprised by how little people understand about the natural world, and very much welcome the introduction of natural history into the GCSE subjects. The role doesn't have any power and so isn't a threat. I would say that a voice of nature is a very safe thing to introduce to any organisation. It's valuable to include, and it's the first step on a very long road to change our understanding of and our relationship with nature. But hopefully, voices of nature can be a catalyst for wider cultural change within organisations. And in my experience, the support of just one single influential person within the organisation is invaluable in enabling the voice of nature to have a greater reach within the organisation and to be accepted by it. It makes a huge difference, the level of support within the organisation for it. The voice of nature or voice of the river can encourage organisations to question the impacts of their decisions on nature, which has a great deal of value, but only if they're correct in how they interpret their impact on nature, and then they have to be willing to change their impact. For a voice of nature on a board to be meaningful, it must enable significant cultural shift within the organisation, changes to policies, procurement, planning. There needs to be some measurable outcomes for nature. Organisations could choose to set measurable targets for nature to see differences after including nature within a board. On the Wye, I want to see the physical restoration of the river, the setting aside of wetland habitats on both sides of the river. Rivers recover very, very quickly. And if we can get more balanced protection for them through positive action, we will see great changes very quickly. It's very important within this role to stay focused on the role. A voice of nature role or voice of the river can be a very, very broad role. And in my experience, they are very open roles. You have to decide for yourself where and how the role will be most impactful. My worry is that we don't have time for the slow cultural change needed to create new cultural understanding of nature. We need governments to act as if our lives depend on nature's recovery, because they do. Thank you.